Would you watch a historical film set in Britain in 1974 that went like this?
She wants to get married. There's no two ways. She has done for a long time. But I don't know, Tom seems to have a wrap around his little finger. I think, quite honestly, he should play ball. He told her when they get a new flat they will be married, but I can't see it coming off, quite honestly.
I personally would. This is my kind of thing. I like the kind of longer form naturalistic stuff, and I find that when it's done right it really helps me feel like I'm in the past. I think film provides an extraordinary opportunity to show this kind of depth. Things you take for granted in your own life, like the intonation of someone's voice or what noise they make when they're trying to think of the next sentence. I think everything in my clip is historically accurate. The mug was probably made in the 1970s, it was an old one my grandmother had. The wall was made in the 1950s, I think the garage was as well. My clothes I think stylistically are about right, although an expert might be able to pick holes in them. And the speech itself is lifted straight from 1974.
She wants to get married. There's no two ways. She has done for a long time. But I don't know, Tom can seem to twist around his little finger. I think, quite honestly, he should play ball. He promised her that when they get a new flat they will be married. I can't see it coming off, quite honestly.
Me and some close friends are filmmakers, and we've been making it more of a professional endeavour recently. I've done one historical one on this channel, and we're doing a few more, although we don't only do historical stuff. And so we've had to think about different ways of presenting history. In this particular clip, which I just made for this video, I've made a few creative decisions. I've shot it from a first-person perspective, as if you're having a conversation with me, because I think this reflects the physical experience of being human a bit more. I've put a tiny bit of zoom blur at the edges because peripheral vision is much worse around the edges, and also because vignetting things like that can be a nice way of keeping your attention in the middle. In these situations, you also have to decide how you're going to colour grade the shot. Do you want it to look particularly cool or warm? And do you want the dynamic range to be particularly low or high? Dynamic range, as I've said in another video, is what range of brightnesses your shot contains detail in. In other words, if the shaded areas are compressed to completely black and the bright areas are completely white, you have a lower dynamic range because there's a narrower range of luminance where you can see detail. As an aside, dynamic range is something I used to get confused about a lot, because impressionistically this looks more dynamic than this, which looks more boring for want of a better term. But it's easier to see if you have a gradient stretching from dark to light. In the low dynamic range image you can see that the range of distinguishable blue hues is narrower, with the left and right ends of the gradient just being bleached out white or pitch black. In the high dynamic range image you can see that the range where you can distinguish different shades of blue is wider. I've chosen a low contrast, fairly high dynamic range colour grade because human vision is usually very high dynamic range, so this kind of colour grade puts me in the moment a little bit better. A lot of the way I make films is centred around that kind of immersion, but different things are immersive to different people. To me, I find it more immersive to film on a wider angle, shorter focal length lens, because I get a bit more peripheral vision and I can see what's around me. I think one of my collaborators often feels more immersed by a narrow angle, longer focal length shots, because they make you feel closer to the actor. So there's huge subjectivity in this. I found this out for myself when I made a film set in early medieval England, and I tried to mimic Benoit Delhomme's camera work in At Eternity's Gate, moving the camera wherever I wanted without any attempt to stabilise it. I find this kind of camera work really immersive because it makes me feel like I'm the one in the room filming it. But I got a comment on that video advising me to get a gimbal, a piece of equipment for stabilising the camera, and saying that there was no excuse for the shaky camera work. This brought into relief another way in which something that's immersive to me might be the opposite of immersive to other people. The Zone of Interest is a recent film that follows the commandant of Auschwitz and his family going about their daily business without explicitly showing what's happening in the concentration camp. I found this very immersive even though it's filmed in a way I wouldn't normally choose myself, on fixed cameras usually quite far away from what's happening. Again, the very naturalistic acting does a lot of the work here for me. It doesn't feel like the characters have rehearsed a script. In our own films we use improvisation a lot to capture this kind of thing. If the actors don't know what their colleagues are about to say, they have to make up their response on the spot, and this leads to realistic moments of people accidentally interrupting each other and aborting and restarting their sentences, like you would do in natural conversation. Of course, this isn't remotely new in film, but it poses a challenge when you're doing historical stuff, because it means the actors have to spontaneously produce dialogue that's historically appropriate. So you can either write a script which you can check is historically appropriate and have the actors try to make it sound like it was improvised, or you can do an enormous amount of preparation with the actors so that they do improvise something historically appropriate when it comes to filming. When thinking of stories and situations in the past, I find it's best to be very specific. Thinking about it as set in the 1970s is likely to bias your thinking. Sometimes I prefer to think about it as 50 years ago rather than 1974, because then instead of immediately having a load of 70s stereotypes pop into my head, I think of it more as a real time with real depth and diversity and people. The 1970s were famously pretty miserable in Britain, with an enormous amount of poverty and unemployment. Cue the poverty and unemployment colour grade. But of course that doesn't mean that everybody was miserable all the time. What is the specific financial situation your characters are in? Who are they? Conjuring up this kind of complexity is challenging because it's hard to even know what the average person thinks about things now, let alone 20 or 30 years before you were born. What's normal? Are your characters deviant from the norm? I think one of the trickiest things with this is political stuff. The average person in 1974 obviously felt differently about certain issues, but the challenge is to capture the actual real specifics of those opinions and to decide whether or not you want to use them to communicate with a modern audience. It's easy for someone of my generation to look at working class white people from 1970s Britain and think, well, they were really racist and sexist by modern standards, there were some progressive people by modern standards, but those ideas weren't very well developed yet. And obviously this is reductive. The average person probably did have views that were normal then, but would now be considered racist.
We've always been a bit against coloured people, and mainly because I don't like their attitudes.
On the other side of the coin, plenty of people in universities were left-wing to an extent that possibly rivals today, and people were aware of a lot of the same things in relation to racism.
You see one mug and it probably might be by a black guy, and everybody just label him as a mug or something like that.
If, say, a coloured person mugs somebody, it's read in the papers as black boy mugs white girl or something, or whatever he does. But if it's a white person, it doesn't say white boy.
They were asked to come over here. They were brought over in boats, they were offered jobs, they were offered houses. If they threw out the immigrants out of this country, we would not be here.
So I would say it is definitely in the interest of certain sections of the education service to drag their feet. Because let's face it, if all West Indian students were to become model pupils overnight, a lot of people will be picking up their redundancy money at the end of the week.
So the challenge is, if you're going to include that kind of thing, are you going to use it to signal to a modern audience that this is the character you should like and this is the character you should dislike? I tend to, if I'm left to my own devices, I tend to avoid this kind of empathy guiding because I think it can detract from realism, especially in a historical setting where people's baseline opinions and, attitudes to things are different to what they are now. I think in a realistic situation, get 50 people to view the same realistic situation and they're all going to have different interpretations and they're all going to side with different people. And so if, the closer you want your film to be to reality, I think the more complicated it has to be in terms of people's opinions and people's motivations. And I think having a desire to direct people's empathy towards a certain character can get in the way of that realism. And that doesn't mean that it's wrong, obviously, many of the people I collaborate with all take a slightly different view on that, and that's obviously, all of these things are artistically valid, and I'm not suggesting they're not. Stepping away from politics, not only class differences but regional differences can be overlooked in a historical context. I like Downton Abbey a lot, and I appreciate that they were shining a light on the class differences rather than making a documentary about historical language. But if you went back in time and filmed the real-life equivalent of a lot of these scenes, I imagine you'd find a lot of more difficult to understand Yorkshire dialect used when the working class characters were alone together. The 1960s Ken Loach film Kes famously used a lot of dialect, sometimes being difficult for southern audiences to understand as a result.
What will they do when they get up there? Take all its eggs?
There ain't any eggs, the young uns.
Well, there's not to go for there then, is there?
Can I come to your bottom then? Never seen a kestrel's nest before.
Come on then.
A scene in traditional Cumbrian dialect of the 1970s might be similarly difficult to understand if done accurately.
She's rang us every week since we've been on the phone and said, I've done all this for you, I've done all that for you. Now will you help us out of this scrape? And we said, we didn't ask you to and we didn't want you to, so no, we won't. She gets us into the most ridiculous scrapes and she expects us to help us out of them. Well, no, we haven't the time for that.
Accents have changed a lot over the last 70 years, especially Northern English accents, which have had a lot of traditional features sandblasted out of them by Southern influence, but also Southeastern English accents. Listen to this teenager's accent from Reading near London in 1974.
Karen, she hasn't been up here yesterday and she hasn't been up today.
No, that's about the first time.
All right, but she's only moved 3 days.
So? The first day she moved out, she had to come round here.
And now listen to the same speaker 10 years later.
Bring them up, and maybe when they're grown up and gone, if I ever considered marriage, it would be them.
Now onto things like decor and architecture. Again, it helps me to think in terms of 50 years ago rather than in terms of the 1970s. To use something like Vsauce's wording, people didn't just go out on the 1st of January 1970 and buy a 70s microwave, a 70s television and a 70s car. Until very recently, I assumed that televisions in 2005 were massive grey boxes with slightly rounded screens, because that's what ours looked like. But then I discovered that our television had been really old, and televisions made in 2005 looked a lot less archaic. People don't replace the floor because it's a new decade, they do it because the lino's getting a bit mouldy. They may replace the wallpaper because it's looking a bit old-fashioned, but a bit old-fashioned is more likely to mean 40 years old than 10 years old. Rooms change gradually bit by bit. In a film set in the 1960s, rather than decorating a room according to the cutting-edge fashions of the 60s, if you have time, you might even consider when the room was first built, what the first owners might have put in it, and what people might have replaced since then. Some rooms may look more old-fashioned than others. If your film's set in the 60s and you have a chair but it's more 40s style, so what? It's not as if people chucked out all their chairs in 1949 and got new ones. My grandfather got his first car in the early 1950s, and it was a 1936 model. If you're somehow creating a street scene, which I would do on the computer because I don't have the money to hire a load of old cars, it's worth considering what's the average age of a car. Again, if your setting is 1974, don't just look up cars from 1974, because what percentage of people have a brand new car? If you can, look up photos from the time and see what kinds of cars there actually are. Me and my friends recently watched an episode of Gavin and Stacey, which is a British comedy about a Welsh woman and an English man getting into a long-distance relationship, and in all the motorway shots, which must have been filmed in roughly 2006, the average car looked like it was from the 80s or 90s. I don't remember this at all, I suppose because motorways have changed so slowly that I haven't noticed, but it makes sense. Music is the same. Of course, you could have your characters listening to something that came out in 1974 or 73, but consider whether that music would be played by your characters in that setting, if it's effectively modern charts music from their perspective. People in different social situations also caught on to new things more slowly. Nowadays, something like a new kind of technology might spread quickly between distant countries and be accepted by the entire country pretty much at once, but this is subject to change over time. I mentioned that my granda had an oldish car when he first got one in the 50s, but when he was growing up, he didn't really see them at all. On the farm in Cumberland where he grew up, they had shitty old Ferguson tractors, and they used horses and carts for a lot of things you didn't need a tractor for. They didn't have a car, and in fact his mother had an exciting story about the one time she'd been driven in one. We're probably thinking about the late 1940s at this point, a time when cars were extremely well established. If you look up when television broadcasts in the UK started being in colour as standard, you'll find that it was around 1970, but plenty of people in the early 70s just didn't have a colour television. I can't find who, but I remember my dad telling me that an old pool or snooker commentator used to joke, if you're watching in black and white, the cue ball is next to the green one. Plenty of people also didn't have a landline telephone in the early 1970s, despite their having been invented a long time before then. I've said before that the past took place in the same universe as the present, and so a lot of aspects of just being human would probably have felt the same. What the hot sun feels like on your skin, for example. But of course you can overextend this. Nowadays the lights at night in Britain are very bright, at least where I am. The street lights and people's car headlights are all white LEDs, but before, I would guess about 2010, this wasn't the case. Street lights were orange sodium lamps, and so the whole urban world outside felt orange at night in a way that suddenly changed when the LED ones were introduced. Likewise, I remember car headlights suddenly getting very bright and whitish blue around the same time. I remember it looking very futuristic. If you were setting a scene outside at night, the lighting could be really different depending on when you are. Something I've fallen victim to myself, which is quite hard to work around without just fully committing to a time period, is people's physical appearance. If somebody was an early medieval working person who spent all his time outside, he would certainly have a lot more sun damage on his skin than I had in my early medieval film. In fact, someone who does manual labour all the time and has periods of nutritional stress throughout their life might look older for their age than they would in a society where they have basically everything they need. If the characters are undressed, and this is going to a level of method acting that I wouldn't suggest anyone do in practice, but it might be achievable using AI at some point, they might have specific muscle groups that they use more than others, rather than just being uniformly strong as if they'd gone to a gym. They're working for practical reasons, not to make themselves look a certain way. Someone who's been a car mechanic for 20 years will have developed different muscle groups to someone who's been a farmer for 20 years. When you're making a film set in the past with a very limited budget, like I often do, of course you need to play to your abilities. It won't surprise anyone that I set the Old English film around a man who went off into the countryside because it's much easier and cheaper to do that than set it in the middle of a bustling urban centre. I gather that pattern wallpaper was the norm in the 1950s in Britain, but it's not that popular anymore, and you might not have easy access to an era-appropriate room. However, walls that were just one colour did exist in the 1950s, so you'll get away with it if that's all you have. But I think the danger here is that if you choose all of the options that were a bit unusual in your time period but are normal and easier to do now, it will stick out like a sore thumb to anyone who was alive then, and you risk misleading your audience into thinking that normality in the past was unrealistically similar to normality now. I'll give an example. We were filming for an upcoming project in December, which is set in the 1960s, when it was normal to smoke indoors and most adults did. We had a set where we were permitted in theory to smoke indoors, but for health reasons we decided that we wouldn't on this occasion. There is justification for this historically. My grandparents on one side didn't smoke at all in the 1960s, and not only did they not smoke, according to my grandfather they actively sent people outside of the house to have a cigarette, like you might do nowadays. This was because my grandmother had COPD and a load of other horrible respiratory illnesses that I don't think were ever fully medically understood. When I was a kid I wasn't allowed to jump around too much in the house because the dust could set her off. Her mother smoked a lot when Granny was a child, which probably didn't help. Here's a cute picture of me with both of them. So by coincidence, if you were doing a film about them, you could send people outside to smoke and it would be historically accurate. But it's important to acknowledge that it was the exception at the time, not the rule. You don't want future audiences looking at your film and thinking, oh, they sent people out for a cigarette back then. Or, on the other side, assuming that the whole thing must be inaccurate because you've got the smoking thing wrong. The issue of style, how you tell the story, is something I think about quite a lot. I prefer naturalism in acting, like I've said, but cinematic convention is a thorny one. While I like to go my own way with these things, sometimes I do watch those videos about mistakes people make early on when they're learning to make films, just to make sure I don't make any mistakes that are important to me because I didn't do a degree in this or anything like that. On Nick and Laura, I got the audio badly wrong, which is a common problem, and it led to my more experienced friend having to put in a lot of effort to recover the sound as best he could. Often in these videos I see situations where things which to me are stylistically interesting are kind of derided as, for want of a better term, a student filmy. Having a relatively unplanned, conversation-focused film is sometimes seen as a phase filmmakers go through before they get to big long scripts with every shot carefully planned out. The same is true with things like lighting. In a scene set indoors, cinematographers tend towards shots where the light is coming from one angle and the camera is shooting from the other. The result is that this type of shot with a lot of dynamic light and shadow is kind of standard, and shots with flatter lighting, light diffused around the whole room or light coming from the same angle as the camera might be seen as amateurish or a failure to understand how to light a scene. But in real life, people don't walk to one corner of the room to make sure they look as cinematic as possible. This isn't me criticising film convention, but pointing out that there's a bit of a to and fro, showing the past both naturalistically and cinematically is a bit of a tug of war. And that's because adhering completely to cinematic convention is fundamentally unnaturalistic, in my opinion, and being completely naturalistic can make things look amateurish compared to more conventional things. How you approach that tug of war is, of course, your choice. This video was never supposed to be a how-to, it's just a collection of my thoughts on this topic, and I hope that you found at least some of them interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.